So life for women in the colonies before the Revolution varied a great deal depending on where they lived, on whether they were free or enslaved, whether they lived on the frontier or in a town, on what their families did for a living. So it's really hard to generalize. But we can say that for white women, the expectation was that they were to serve their families. And their legal status really reflected that. Their legal status was a Latin term called femme covert, and it implied that their legal identity was covered by a man's, a father or a husband. And so legally, women didn't have very many rights at all, unless they happened to be single women or widowed women who owned property. But for the most part, women were considered to be the property of their husbands. And then on the frontier, you have women, white women, who are even working in the fields at certain times of year or tending to the livestock.
The war couldn't have been won without the women, particularly those not in the cities. In backcountry South Carolina, and of course people in Charleston suggest that's anywhere west of Calhoun Street, you had women who were left at the farm. When the husband went off to fight, they had to maintain the farm. They had to keep the crops going. They had to take care of the children.
If you're going off to fight with Sumter or Marion, you're a yeoman farmer, who's going to take care of the field? Who's going to, and we're not talking about people who have servants, either indentured or slave. Somebody's got to run the place. And it's the women. And also putting up with having to confront the British firsthand, and people like Tarleton were not very nice in their treatment of patriot women.
Certainly any woman who comes into contact with the fighting, whether it's militia fighting in the backcountry or whether it's the occupation of Charleston, those women are going to find their daily lives disrupted. For example, we have accounts from a Charleston woman named Eliza Wilkinson who talked about soldiers coming into the house once the city was invaded, and British soldiers stealing everything down to their dresses, their shoe buckles, even the doors and shutters off of the house. So these women are finding daily life very disrupted. And in the backcountry, the same thing is going on. And both loyalist and militia women are getting caught in the crossfire. With General Washington's army in particular, and to some extent with Nathaniel Greene's army here in the South, there were groups of women called camp followers. And that's a term that often people think refers to prostitutes. And there were prostitutes who traveled with the army. But most camp followers were actually wives of soldiers who really had no way of making a living. And so they would follow the army from place to place. They would do laundry, they would bake, they would do nursing, they would cook. The war created a lot of disruption, particularly for women from the lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum.
One of my favorite women in the war is Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson, who happened to be the mother of one of our future presidents, Andrew Jackson. She had several members of the family that were fighting on the Patriot side. And at the horrible Battle of Waxhaws, which resulted in what we call Buford's Massacre, and there were any number of very seriously injured, very seriously wounded patriots on the field, she was in the middle of taking care of those people. She started at that point. Sometime later, two of her sons, including Andrew, who was called Andy at the time, were captured by the British. They also got some diseases while they were in the prison. Those prisons were horrible places to be. And she went down to Camden to the commander of the British forces at the time, Lord Rawdon, and convinced him to let her take her two sons home.
She became sort of a martyr for the cause, because in 1780, after the fall of Charleston, she travels to Charleston. The legend is that she was going to serve as a nurse for the prisoners of war. Probably most sources say that she was actually going to try to secure the release of two of her nephews who were being held prisoner. Patriots who were imprisoned at Charleston were held on ships out in the harbor, and those ships were infested with various diseases. And she went on board one of the ships. She contracted some disease. It was probably typhus or cholera, and she died in Charleston in the summer of 1780.
Somebody like that, you can't, it might be a small incident in a large war, but to the people around her, she was the most important thing in their lives as their lives were leaving them. And that's just a wonderful thing when you're putting yourself out there knowing that you're probably not going to make it yourself. So I can't help but respect somebody like that.
There were a lot of women who participated either by carrying messages or by spying and contributing intelligence, carrying intelligence from one militia unit to another or one army unit to another. There are several stories about women who contributed intelligence that helped the Continental Army at the Battle of Cowpens.
Emily Giger, wow, that's a great legend for the Midlands. Emily was supposedly a young girl, and she was given the task of delivering a message from General Nathaniel Greene to General Thomas Sumter. And to do so, she had to ride through British territory. Supposedly she was captured, taken to the upstairs of Fort Granby. The commander said he was too much of a British gentleman to search her. He was going to send for a Tory maiden to come in and take a look. And so they locked her in the room, and Emily got her message out, which was written out on a piece of paper. She memorized it as quickly as she could. She tore it up into strips. She put it in her mouth, and she ate it. And when they came in to search her, they couldn't find it. And supposedly she rode away the next day, and she was able to get to General Sumter's camp and deliver the message verbally to Sumter. So this is a great legend, and we love our legends, but we're not really sure that Emily existed. The story itself is an oral story. It doesn't actually appear in print until 1824. We can find no documents, military documents or otherwise, other than this oral story. She may have been real, but we don't have a way to actually document that. However, she represents a great archetype, an archetype of women who are making sacrifices to win the revolution. It's a great story. We love to tell the story of Emily, and we think it's a great legend that needs to stay around for a while.
I think a lot of times when we look at history, there are a lot of stories that are embellished legends, and it can still be valuable to tell those stories. We just have to say, here's what we know for sure, here's what we can't know for sure, but this story seems likely for these reasons. There's no doubt in my mind that a lot of women were carrying messages to troops. There's no doubt in my mind that a lot of women were reporting on the locations of troops. So there are a lot of things that women did to help the cause that passed under the radar.
Rebecca Mott is a well-known story in South Carolina. She had family in Charleston. Her brother was Miles Bruton, and when he died, she took over a house there. She was married. She wanted to move to a plantation home she had. She built a house there, a very nice new house, and moved into it. And then the British decided they needed it as a fort along the road to protect the supply road. And they built a stockade around her house and called it Fort Mott. When Francis Marion came to try to take Fort Mott from the British, they decided to try to set the house on fire to make the British give up. Rebecca Mott found out about it, and the story is that she went and found some fire arrows and a bow that her husband had gotten from a trip to Africa. and gave it to them. Not only did she freely say, yes, go ahead and burn my brand new house, but she helped provide the tools to do so. They did. They were successful in setting the house on fire. The British eventually surrendered, but after the surrender was over, Ms. Mott invited all of the officers of both sides to dinner that night and fed them together, for both the people who had caused her house to be burned and the people she had told it's okay to burn it. We have a lot of strong-willed women in South Carolina, and this is what they come from.
Probably the greatest heroine, Jane Black Thomas. Her husband had commanded the Spartan Regiment. He was captured, and he was imprisoned at the Star Fort, 96. Well, he got sick, and of course, in the days of the Revolution, or any time, they weren't taking care of prisoners. They put the word out, you come take care of your husband. Well, she did, and she overheard some British officers' wives talking about they were going to have a raid up in Spartan District, as it was then known, on the Spartan Regiment, which was now commanded by her son. So what this woman, who was over 60, did, she stole a horse, rode over 50 miles through enemy-occupied territory to warn the Spartan Regiment, and they, in turn, ambushed the British raid at the Battle of Cedar Springs. Now, as I have often said, what was more heroic? Jane Black Thomas, an aged woman, stealing a horse, riding through enemy-occupied territory, and it wasn't on a turnpike, and Paul Revere riding down a paved road saying, the British are coming, the British are coming. She completed her mission, he didn't.
There are probably a dozen or more known instances of women actually participating in the fighting as soldiers. And these are women who would dress as men and become part of an army or a militia unit. In the South, we know that a woman named Sally St. Clair dressed as a man and served in militia units in Georgia and then with the Continental Army, and she died in the Siege of Savannah.
The Sons of the American Revolution in Philadelphia sponsored a conference back in 2017 or 2018, and it was about women's experiences in the Revolution, and the request was for scholarship that was less well-traveled. And so I offered Lucy Banbury's story, because she was a woman who self-emancipated from Declaration of Independence signer Arthur Middleton here in South Carolina, and she essentially became one of the Black Loyalists who was sent to Nova Scotia after her service to the British Army and ended up a free property-owning woman. So her story was previously unknown. The pieces of it had been collected by Middleton Place Foundation, but I was the one to create them into a narrative so that we could present her story alongside these other women's experiences of the Revolution.
Phyllis Wheatley, for example, an enslaved woman, and the first slave and the first African-American to write a book of poetry in the 1770s that supported the American patriot side.
Phyllis Wheatley's story is pretty unique. The fact that she was enslaved in New England, the fact that she was educated, that she was a poet. She wrote patriotic poetry. When she went to England in 1773, the decree at the time, the law there was any enslaved person that set foot on English soil was free. So the minute she stepped off the boat in England, she was a free woman. When she came back from England, nobody argued, nobody put up a fuss, nobody tried to re-enslave her.
In the Cherokee tribes, families trace their lineage through the women. So you kept track of who your mother's relatives were, and your father married into the mother's family. very different from the patriarchal notions of the British. It was not female dominated, but it was a society where women had a whole lot more voice in public decision making.
During the Revolution, part of this area was a place for people fighting in the Revolution to come. It was an encampment where they could come and get supplies and foods and clothing. It was just supplied by Catawba women.
For indigenous communities in Eastern North America, generally at large, men are going to traditionally be hunters, warriors. Women are going to be agriculturalists and stewards of the land. For both Catawba and Cherokee people. For the Catawba, it might mean that they have resources to provide the American patriots when they need supplies. If men are away fighting or hunting, the women are going to be in control of the land. Particularly important, they're going to be in control of what the land produces, what is done with that land, what is done with its products, how that harvest is distributed.
I think there's a myth that wars were historically male enterprises. And we often forget that wars, especially wars fought in the place where you live, engulf everybody in the conflict. And they pay a price, even if they're on the winning side.